The gun was already in her hand when Clayton Barnett walked through the door of the Half Moon Saloon, and every soul in that room held their breath waiting to see which one of them would break first. Edna Carver stood at the center of the sawdust-covered floor with her shoulders squared and her jaw set like iron. The derringer pointed not at Clayton, but at the man pressed against the bar behind her, Silas Prout, the land agent who had spent the better part of 3 months trying to convince the county courthouse that Edna did not exist, that the deed to her late father's farm was a forgery, and that the 40 acres of good Kansas soil she had bled and starved and wept over were, in fact, his. "You put that paper down on the bar," Edna said, and her voice did not shake, which surprised even her. "You put it down, you uncap that ink bottle, and you sign your name to the truth. Or I promise you, Silas Prout, I will find a way to make sure every man in Caldwell, Kansas knows exactly what you did to my father's estate." Prout's face was the color of old ash. He was a large man, heavyset with a gray mustache that made him look more respectable than he had any right to be, and he was not used to women looking at him the way Edna was looking at him right now. Clayton had frozen just inside the doorway, his hat still pushed back from the hard ride, his dark eyes sweeping the room in one practiced motion, the way a man does when he has spent enough years in dangerous places to never fully stop watching for trouble. He saw the derringer. He saw Prout's sweating face. He saw Edna's back, the rigid, furious, terrified line of her spine, and something in his chest did a thing it had not done in a very long time. "Edna," he said quietly. She did not turn around. "I told you to stay at the livery, Clayton. I know you did. Then why are you standing in my saloon?" "Because," he said, just as quietly, stepping into the room and letting the door swing shut behind him, "Hector Vane and 2 of his men just rode in from the South Road, and they are heading this way, and whatever you are trying to settle here needs to be settled in the next 4 minutes. The name Hector Vane landed in the room like a stone dropped in still water. Every man at the bar found something fascinating to study on the floor. The piano player lifted both hands off the keys, and Edna Carver, who had faced down a drought, a dishonest land agent, 2 seasons of rust blight, and the slow death of a man she loved more than the earth itself, finally turned around and looked at Clayton Barnett. 6 weeks earlier, she had not known he existed. The farm her father, Amos Carver, had built over 30 years of frontier stubbornness, sat 12 miles southeast of Caldwell at the edge of a creek that ran full in spring and barely trickled in August. It was 1879, and Caldwell was a cattle town still swollen with the energy of the Texas cattle drives pushing up through Indian Territory, a place loud with commerce and corruption in roughly equal measure. Edna had grown up on that farm, had watched her mother die there when she was 11, had watched her father's hair go gray and his hands go gnarled doing honest work on land that did not always cooperate. When Amos died in February, 3 days after a fever took hold of him too fast for the doctor from Wichita to arrive in time, Edna was 26 years old, and she was alone. She had one hired hand, an old Osage man named George who had worked the creek bottom with her father for 15 years and who stayed on out of loyalty and a stubbornness that matched her own. She had 40 acres, a sound well, a barn that needed a new roof, and a deed to the property filed at the Sumner County Courthouse that was as legitimate as anything written on paper could be. What she did not have was a man's name on any of it. In 1879, Kansas, that was not yet a legal disqualification for a woman owning property outright. But it was a practical one, because men like Silas Prout knew exactly which clerks to befriend and which records to misfile, and which judges to send a bottle of good whiskey at the right moment. By March, Prout had filed a competing claim, asserting that Amos Carver had borrowed against the land in 1876 and died indebted to Prout's lending office, and that the deed held by Edna was superseded by the lien. Edna knew it was a lie. She had gone through every one of her father's papers, every ledger, every receipt, every scrap of correspondence, and there was no record of any loan. But proving a lie required a lawyer, and a good lawyer in Caldwell in 1879 cost more than she had, and the lawyer she could afford was a man named Beaumont who smelled of pipe tobacco and patent remedy, and who told her with genuine sorrow that her situation was complicated. She had ridden to Caldwell 3 times in March to argue her case at the courthouse, and been turned away twice by a clerk who was visibly uncomfortable, and once by a deputy who told her, not unkindly, which made it worse, that she ought to think about selling and finding herself somewhere comfortable to land. She went home each time and did the work that needed doing, because the fields would not plant themselves and the cattle would not water themselves, and misery did not excuse a person from the obligations of living. It was on the 4th trip into town, in early April when the prairie grass was just beginning to go green at the edges, that she met Clayton Barnett. She had stopped at the general store to collect a sack of flour and a tin of coffee, and to ask Merle Hackworth behind the counter whether the circuit judge had set a new date for civil hearings, which Merle knew because Merle knew everything that happened in Caldwell. Merle told her the judge was due in 3 weeks, which was either good news or terrible news depending on whether Pruitt had managed to get his fraudulent paperwork in order by then. Edna was standing at the counter working out the arithmetic of 3 weeks against her resources when the bell above the door rang and a man walked in. He was tall, not dramatically so, but enough that he had to angle his hat slightly coming through the frame. He wore trail clothes that had been good once and were still clean, and he had the particular economy of movement that Edna associated with men who spent most of their time outdoors, and had long since stopped wasting energy on unnecessary things. His face was angular, weathered to a color a few shades darker than the Kansas summer, with dark eyes that took in the room without being obvious about it. He asked Merle for ammunition, a box of .44 440 cartridges, and paid for it in coin. Then he noticed Edna, or rather he noticed that she was looking at him with the direct, assessing look she gave everyone, and instead of glancing away he looked back, and there was something in it that was not presumptuous but was also not shy. "I beg your pardon," Edna said, because she had been staring and she knew it. "I was trying to determine whether I recognized you." "Clayton Barnett," he said, and he touched the brim of his hat in a way that was just courtesy, nothing performative about it. "I don't believe we've met." Edna Carver. She offered her hand, which she did by habit because her father had always shaken hands with everyone regardless of their sex or station, and she had grown up thinking that was simply how people introduced themselves. Clayton shook it without making any kind of point of it, which she noticed. "Are you passing through?" she asked. "Looking for work," he said. "I've done ranch management, some cattle driving, some scouting. I heard the Fenwick spread north of here was hiring foremen." "The Fenwick spread is north and west," she said. "You want to take the creek road, not the main trail. Faster." She paused. "Are you any good with legal documents?" He looked at her. "Not specifically." "Why?" She was not, later, entirely sure why she told him. Perhaps it was because she was exhausted and the weight of it had been pressing on her long enough that it simply needed somewhere to go. Perhaps it was because he had that quality that some people carry without knowing it, of making you feel that what you say will be taken seriously, handled carefully, not dismissed. She told him about the deed, about Pruitt's claim, about the fraudulent lien and the unhelpful lawyer and the circuit judge coming in 3 weeks. He listened without interrupting, which was rarer than it should have been. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Do you have copies of your father's financial records? Everything he kept? Every scrap?" "There's a man in Wichita named Theodore Alcott. He is a property attorney who has successfully challenged fraudulent liens before, specifically in cases where the original lending documentation cannot be produced, which it cannot be in your case because the loan never happened." He paused. "I know him because I had a similar situation with my father's land in Missouri 8 years ago. Different outcome, but I know how the process works." Edna stared at him. "Why would you know that?" Because I made it my business to understand it, he said simply. After we lost the land. The flatness of that last sentence contained a whole history she could hear around the edges, and she did not press it because it was not her to press. Instead, she said, I cannot afford to hire someone in Wichita. Alcott works on a percentage of what he recovers, Clayton said. If the claim is as fraudulent as you're describing, he would take it. She looked at him for a long moment. Why are you telling me this? He seemed to consider the question honestly. Because you asked, he said, and because it's the right thing. That was the beginning of it. He did not go to the Fenwick spread that day. Instead, he rode back out toward her farm, which she had not exactly invited him to do, but also had not told him not to. And he inspected the barn roof, and said he could fix it for room and board while she sorted out her legal troubles. And she agreed, partly because the barn roof genuinely needed fixing, and partly because she had the unexplainable conviction that Clayton Barnett was exactly what he appeared to be, which in her experience was a remarkable and nearly unique quality in a person. George, who was not a man easily impressed and who had opinions about most things, watched Clayton work that first afternoon and told Edna that evening that the man knew what he was doing with a hammer and a saw and that he was not wasting material, which was high praise from George. He is also, George added, paying attention to things. What things? Edna asked. George pointed his chin toward the south pasture where Clayton had stopped work and was standing very still, looking at the fence line. Tracks, he said. Edna followed George's gaze. She had not seen any unusual tracks, but she also had been spending most of her mental energy on Prout and the courthouse, and she could acknowledge she had not been looking. Someone has been riding the fence line, George said. At night, probably, looking the property over. She felt cold in her stomach. Prout's men, George shrugged. Or Vane's. Hector Vane was a name that arrived in Caldwell conversations the way storm weather arrived on the prairie. You felt it before it was fully there. He was a land speculator and cattleman who operated out of a compound east of town, and he had been buying up homestead properties all through Sumner County for the past 2 years, sometimes paying fair prices and sometimes not, and sometimes the homesteaders who refused to sell had a habit of encountering problems that made the decision to sell feel more attractive. Edna had heard his name in connection with Prout's, though she had no proof of any arrangement between them. She had assumed it was rumor. Now, looking at the fence line in the late afternoon light, she was not so sure. Clayton came back to the barn as the sun was dropping, and she asked him directly what he had seen. Fresh tracks from 2 horses, he said, washing his hands at the pump. Maybe 3 nights old. They came in from the east, rode the south fence, then doubled back. Assessing the property, she said. Looking at the creek access specifically, he said. Whoever is interested in your land, it's not just the acreage, it's the water. She had known this in a vague way, but hearing it stated plainly gave it a different weight. The creek that ran through her father's property was reliable water in a county where reliable water was the difference between surviving and not. And in 1879, with the cattle trade still booming, water rights were worth a significant amount of money to the right buyer. So this is bigger than a dishonest land agent, she said. Probably has been from the start, Clayton said. He looked at her steadily. Does that change what you want to do? No, she said immediately. And he nodded, and that was that. She wrote to Theodore Alcott in Wichita that night and posted the letter the next morning, enclosing a summary of her documentation and Prout's fraudulent claim. Then she came back to the farm and went to work, because 3 weeks felt like nothing and everything needed to be done. Clayton fixed the barn roof in 2 days. Then he restrung the south fence, which had been weakening since autumn. Then he repaired the pump mechanism that had been sticking, and rehung the gate on the south pasture, and did a dozen other things that George pointed out needed doing, and that Edna had been mentally scheduling for 6 months without the extra hands to accomplish. He worked with the particular efficiency of someone who did not waste time, but also did not hurry past the work, who understood that things done quickly and poorly cost more in the long run than things done carefully. In the evenings, Edna cooked supper. She was a good plain cook, which her father had insisted she learn because he said a person who could not feed themselves was only ever one bad day away from ruin, and the three of them ate at the kitchen table and talked, or sometimes did not talk, and both were equally comfortable. She learned things about Clayton in fragments, the way you learn things about a person who is more accustomed to listening than to speaking. He had grown up in Missouri in a farming family. His father had died when he was 22, and the bank had called in a mortgage he had not known existed, and the farm had gone. He had spent the years since doing work wherever he could find at cattle drives, scouting for survey parties, a brief stint as a deputy in a Colorado mining town that he described with the minimal detail of someone who did not enjoy the memory. He was 30 years old, and he had been moving for 8 years, and she could tell, in the way that you can tell about people, that the moving was not entirely by preference. She did not ask him about all of it. There were things in his expression sometimes, particularly in the evenings when the light went low, and he sat on the porch steps looking at the horizon, that had the quality of old weight. She recognized it because she had spent enough time sitting with her own. What she noticed, what registered somewhere below the level of conscious thought and built quietly over those 2 weeks without announcing itself, was how he spoke to her. He listened when she spoke. He did not simplify things for her or explain things she already knew. When she had an opinion about the best approach to her legal case, and it differed from his suggestion, he considered her opinion on its merits rather than dismissing it because she was a woman, and twice he told her that she was right. He did not hover or try to manage things or make decisions on her behalf. He simply did what was useful and asked what was needed. And she did not feel small. She had felt small, she realized. She had been feeling it for 3 months, since the first time the courthouse clerk looked through her instead of at her, since the first time Lawyer Beaumont's expression had shifted from professional sympathy to the particular helplessness of a man who does not believe a woman is capable of understanding her own predicament. She had felt small at the bar in Caldwell, when men who knew her father gave her condolences and advice in the same breath, and neither had asked what she intended to do. She had felt small in her own grief, which had been a grief she had largely swallowed because there was work that needed doing and no one to do it but her. She had not felt small at her kitchen table with Clayton Barnett eating her cooking and telling her that Alcott in Wichita was going to look at her documentation and confirm that Pruitt had fabricated the Leon record and that the circuit judge would throw the competing claim out. He said it as a fact, not as comfort, because he had looked at her documentation himself and he knew what it showed. The letter from Alcott came 11 days after she had sent her own. It was direct and professional. He had reviewed her summary. He believed the case was clear. He would ride to Caldwell for the circuit court hearing, and he would take 20% of whatever settlement or judgment she received for any damages caused by the fraudulent claim. If there were no such damages, he would take nothing. She read the letter at the kitchen table with George sitting across from her and Clayton standing by the window where the morning light came in, and when she finished she set it down very carefully and said, "He's coming." "Good," Clayton said. She looked at him. There was a quality in the room that she could not quite account for, a brightness that was not sunlight, a warmth that had nothing to do with the stove. She had an impulse to say something about it and could not find language for what it was, so instead she said, "Thank you for knowing his name." "You would have found your way to him without me," Clayton said. "Maybe," she said, "but 3 weeks later and it would have cost me." He looked at her steadily. "You are a very capable woman, Edna Carver." "I know," she said, and there was nothing arrogant in it, just plain truth, because her father had raised her to know her own worth and she had spent enough years testing it to have an accurate measure. But capable doesn't mean you don't need help sometimes. He nodded like that was a reasonable and obvious thing, which it was, but it was the first time in months anyone had agreed with both halves of it simultaneously. The hearing was in 6 days when things went sideways. It was George who noticed first. He came in from the south pasture before supper looking older than his years, and he told Edna and Clayton that there was a man with a rifle set up in the low ridge to the east watching the farm. "Since this morning," George said, "I walked the creek bank and I could see him from below the cut bank. He is not hiding well. Maybe he wants to be seen." "A warning," Clayton said, and his voice had gone quiet in a particular way. "Someone wants you to be thinking about this when you walk into that courtroom." Edna felt the cold in her stomach again, deeper this time. "Prute. Or Vane," Clayton said. "Or both. They are in this together, I think. Prute files the fraudulent claim to tie up the deed, and Vane is waiting on the other end to purchase the property at a distressed price once your claim is dismissed. That's the pattern." She had been thinking exactly the same thing. "Can you prove that?" "Not yet," he said, "but I don't need to prove it for the hearing. Alcott just needs to prove the lien is fabricated, which he can do." "Then what is the rifle for?" "Intimidation," Clayton said. "They want you to settle before you get to court. They want you to decide that 40 acres is not worth your safety." She stood very still in the kitchen and she thought about her father's hands, and the way the morning light came through the east window in summer, and the sound the creek made in spring when it was running fast, and she thought about 30 years of work and what it meant to let it be taken by cowards. "I am not settling," she said. "I know," Clayton said. She looked at him. "But I need to know, are you in this with me, or are you leaving before it gets worse?" He looked back at her, and there was something in it that was not complicated at all, which made it feel larger than complicated things sometimes are. "I'm in it," he said. They moved carefully over the next 3 days. Clayton sent a telegram to the Caldwell sheriff, a man named Eustace Horner who had a reputation for at least attempting to be honest, reporting the surveillance and requesting that a deputy check the East Ridge. The deputy found evidence of a camp, but the man with the rifle was gone, which meant he had been watching them watch for him, which was both reassuring and not. Alcott arrived from Wichita on the train 2 days before the hearing, and he was exactly what Clayton had described. A precise, unhurried man of about 50, with a leather case full of documents, and a manner that suggested he had seen every variety of legal deception, and was not interested in being surprised by any of them. He reviewed Edna's full documentation that evening at the kitchen table, going through it piece by piece with the systematic thoroughness of someone who understood that details were the whole of the matter. At the end, he said, "The lien Prute has presented is a fabrication. The document purports to have been notarized in Caldwell in October 1876, but the notary whose seal appears on it, a man named Josiah Wren, died in August 1876. I verified this before I came. The seal itself may be a forgery, or it may be a genuine stolen seal used after Wren's death. Either way, the document is fraudulent on its face, and I will demonstrate this to the judge." Edna felt something release in her chest that had been clenched for 3 months. "How did Prute expect this to survive scrutiny?" she asked. "He expected," Alcott said, "that you would not be able to afford scrutiny. Most people cannot. That is the strategy. File a claim plausible enough to intimidate, legitimate enough to appear to require resources to challenge, and wait for the other party to exhaust themselves or give up." He looked at her over the tops of his reading glasses. "He underestimated you, Miss Carver." "He underestimated me," she agreed. Clayton was sitting at the far end of the table, and she looked at him, and he was already looking at her, and he did that thing with his expression that was not quite a smile, but was warmer than one. The hearing was on a Friday. Caldwell's courthouse was a 2-story brick building that smelled of old paper and pipe smoke, and by 9 in the morning there were more people in the gallery than Edna had expected, because word had gotten around the way it did in small towns where news was currency. Prute arrived with his own lawyer, a man from Wichita named Grisham who had a louder suit than Alcott and a louder manner, and who began the proceedings by challenging Edna's standing as a party to the claim on the grounds that she was an unmarried woman without a male guardian. Edna had expected this. Alcott addressed it in 2 sentences. citing the Kansas statute from 1868 that gave women the right to hold property in their own names, and the judge, a circuit man named Farrow who wore glasses and had the expression of a man who had been lied to many times and resented it, ruled the challenge dismissed. Then Alcott presented the evidence regarding Josiah Wren. Grisham did his best. He suggested that Wren might have signed the document before his death and that the notarization date was a clerical error. Alcott produced the death certificate, and the county register showing Wren's last recorded notarization was in July 1876, 2 months before the date on Pruitt's document. Grisham suggested the records might be in error. The judge took his glasses off and looked at Grisham for a long, uncomfortable moment. "Counselor," Judge Farrow said, "are you suggesting that the county records of Sumner County, Kansas, are in error regarding the date of a man's death?" Grisham said that he was not suggesting anything of the kind, only that errors were possible, and the judge put his glasses back on and said that he was going to reserve judgment until he had reviewed all the documentation, but that his preliminary reading of the evidence was that the lien presented by Mr. Pruitt appeared to be fraudulent, and that unless Mr. Grisham had something materially different to offer, the court was inclined to find in favor of Miss Carver. Grisham did not have anything materially different to offer. Edna was sitting at the plaintiff's table with her hands folded and her spine straight, and she was not going to let herself feel the relief yet. Not in this room, not with Pruitt still sitting 20 feet away from her looking at the table with the expression of a man who is rapidly revising his plans. Beside her, Alcott made a small note on his pad. She glanced back once at the gallery. Clayton was in the third row, hat in his hands, and he caught her eye and gave her one slow, steady nod. She turned back to the front of the room. Judge Farrow adjourned for 1 hour and came back with his written ruling. The fraudulent lien was dismissed. Amos Carver's original deed was confirmed as the sole valid title to the property. Silas Pruitt was ordered to pay court costs and was referred to the county prosecutor for investigation of the fraudulent documentation. The gallery made noise. Edna sat still for a moment, just breathing. Then she stood up, shook Alcott's hand, thanked him, and walked out of that courthouse into the April Kansas sunshine, and she stood on the steps and looked out at the wide, loud, chaotic street of Caldwell, and she thought, "It is mine. It is still mine." Clayton was behind her. She heard his footstep on the courthouse steps and turned, and he was there with his hat in his hand still, and the sun on his face, and she did something she had not done in front of another person since her father's funeral. She started to cry, not dramatically. Just her eyes filled up and spilled over, and she blinked them back, but not before he saw. He did not say anything about it. He did not try to minimize it or reassure her that it was fine to cry or any of the things that people say when they are uncomfortable with someone else's emotion. He just stood there, present and steady, and let it be what it was. "Thank you," she said when she could. "It was your fight," he said. "I just handed you one name. You stayed," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I was going to go to the Fenwick spread," he said. "I had decided that morning in Hackworth's store. The job paid well and I needed the work." He paused. "And then you told me about your father's land, and I thought about my father's land, and I could not make myself leave." She looked at him. "Why?" He seemed to consider how to answer honestly. "Because it mattered," he said, "and because you mattered." She did not know what to do with that, and so she filed it somewhere careful and said, "Come back to the farm. I'm making a proper supper tonight, and George deserves to hear the news." They rode back together along the creek road as the afternoon softened, and she told him that she had been thinking about the east pasture, about whether to expand her small cattle herd now that the property was secure. And he had thoughts about that which were practical and well-reasoned, and they talked it through the whole 12 miles. And at some point she realized she was not anxious, which she had been, in some low-level constant way, for 3 months. George was at the barn when they arrived, and when Edna told him, he stood very still, and then he said, in the measured way he said most things, "Good. Your father would be glad." And then he went back to what he was doing, because George expressed satisfaction through continuing to work, which was something Edna understood perfectly. Supper that night was roast chicken and cornbread and preserved peaches from the cellar, and Clayton ate 2 plates of it and complimented the cooking with genuine feeling. And George ate 1 plate and said that the peaches were better than last year's, which was true. And Edna drank coffee and felt the strange, specific lightness of a weight that had been carried for so long that you forgot it was there, until the moment it was gone. After, she and Clayton sat on the porch steps in the evening cool, and the sky above the Kansas prairie was that particular luminous dark blue of late spring, and the stars were just beginning to come through. "What happens to Prout?" she asked. "The prosecutor will investigate," Clayton said. "Whether he brings charges depends on how much evidence there is of intent. The fraudulent document is enough to dismiss the claim, but prosecuting him for it requires proving he knew it was fraudulent when he filed it, which is a harder bar." "He knew," Edna said. "Yes," Clayton said. "I expect the prosecutor knows that too, but politics are politics." "And Vane?" There was a pause. "Vane is more careful," Clayton said. "He doesn't put his own name on anything that can be traced, but if Prout is facing prosecution, he may decide this particular county is not worth the trouble." Another pause. "Or he may not." She turned to look at him. In the dim porch light his profile was clear and still, and she had the thought, not for the first time, that he was a man who said less than he thought, and that what he thought was usually worth hearing. "You said today that I mattered," she said. He did not look startled exactly, but he went still in a particular way. "I did." "I want to know what you meant by it," she said, because she had learned very young from a father who valued direct speech that the most reliable way to know what something meant was to ask. He turned to look at her. The honesty in his expression was the same quality she had noticed the first day in Hackworth's store, not performed, not managed, just there. "I meant," he said slowly, "that somewhere in the last 2 weeks you stopped being a woman with a legal problem that I could help with and became someone I was not willing to leave." She held that for a moment. "That is a significant thing to say." "Yes," he agreed. "I know. You're not planning to stay," she said. "You have been moving for 8 years." "I know that too," he said. She looked out at the prairie dark. The creek made its small sound in the distance. A coyote called from somewhere south and another answered. "I do not want a man who is here because he thinks I need managing," she said. "I have had enough of men who want to manage things on my behalf." "I know," he said. "I have noticed." "I am also," she said, "not going to pretend that the last 2 weeks have not been important to me, because they have been, and I do not see the point in pretending otherwise." He was looking at her with an expression that she could not entirely read, which was unusual because she was generally a good reader of people. There was something in it that was careful and warm at the same time, the way a person holds something valuable. "What would it look like," he said, "if I asked to stay?" "That depends," she said, "on what staying means to you." "Permanent," he said without hesitation. She looked at him for a long moment. "I am not an easy woman to live with," she said. "I have opinions about everything. I keep my own accounts. I make decisions without asking first, and sometimes I am wrong about them, and sometimes I am not, but either way I make them myself." "I know," he said. "I've been watching you for 2 weeks." And she said, and he said very quietly, "That is exactly the woman I'm asking to stay for." She looked down at her hands for a moment and then back at him. "There is something you should know first," she said. "About Hector Vane." Clayton waited. "He came to this farm in March," she said. "Before you came, before any of this started. He came personally, which George told me later was unusual. Vane does not usually show his face. He made an offer for the property, a fair offer actually, better than the land would fetch in a normal sale." "Why didn't you take it?" Clayton asked. "Because he made it the week after my father was buried," she said. "And he knew that my father had just died, and the offer was fair only because he assumed I was desperate enough that fair was enough. He sat at my kitchen table and told me, very kindly, that a young woman alone on 40 acres of frontier land was in a precarious situation, and that selling was the sensible thing. She paused. And I told him that I appreciated his offer but that I was not interested, and he smiled in a way that I have not forgotten, and he said he hoped I would reconsider, and he left. And then Prout filed the fraudulent claim, Clayton said. 2 weeks later, she said. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. You think Prout failing in court won't be enough to stop Vane? I think Vane is not a man who accepts the word no, she said, and I think he has resources and patience. And I think Prout is facing legal jeopardy now and is possibly feeling desperate, which makes him dangerous. What are you telling me? Clayton asked. I'm telling you, she said, that staying here may not be peaceful, that if you are going to stay, you should know the full weight of what that is. He looked at her steadily. I appreciate you telling me. Well, she said, you deserve to make an informed decision. And then he did something she had not expected. He reached over very carefully and covered her hand with his, and the warmth of it was startling in the spring night air. Edna, he said, I'm not going anywhere. She let herself feel that. She did not argue with it or test it further. She just let it settle, and it settled the way true things do, not with drama, but with the quiet certainty of something finally in its right place. 3 days later, Silas Prout found her in the Half Moon Saloon. She had ridden into town to speak with Alcott before he returned to Wichita, and Alcott had told her that the county prosecutor had expressed interest in the fraudulent deed case and was gathering statements, and that she should expect to be deposed within the week. She had thanked him and seen him off at the train station, and then stopped at the saloon for a coffee. The Half Moon was the only establishment in Caldwell that served coffee all day, which she appreciated, and she had been there 20 minutes when Prout came in. He was not the gray-faced, humbled man she had seen in the courtroom. He was something worse, a man who had decided that embarrassment and legal jeopardy had freed him from caution. He came directly to her table and sat down across from her without being invited, and he put a paper on the table between them. Sign this, he said. She looked at the paper. It was a sale agreement, transferring the Carver farm to a holding company she did not recognize for a price that was 40% below the market value. No, she said. Miss Carver, he said, and his voice had a quality she had not heard before in it, something stripped of its professional veneer. The prosecutor's investigation is going to turn over stones that are going to cause problems for a number of people in this county. People who would prefer those stones stayed down. Those people have ways of making trouble for anyone who keeps stirring things up, ways that have nothing to do with courts. She looked at him, at the sweat on his forehead and the particular quality of his eyes, and understood that he had been sent. He was delivering a message on someone else's behalf. He was, she thought, frightened himself. Silas, she said, and she used his first name deliberately. You are a coward and a fraud, and you have put yourself in serious legal jeopardy. And now someone has sent you here to threaten me because they think I am more afraid of unspecified trouble than I am of giving up my father's land. She paused. They are wrong. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the derringer she had taken to carrying since George reported the man on the ridge, and she set it on the table in front of her, and she did not point it at Prout. She just let it be visible. I want you to go back to whoever sent you, she said, and I want you to tell them that I am not signing anything, and that the prosecutor is going to get every piece of cooperation I can give him, and that if anyone sets foot on my father's property uninvited again, they will answer for it. She looked at him with everything she had: 3 months of grinding stress and legal injustice and sleepless nights, and a grief she had never fully been allowed to finish, and she put all of it in her expression, controlled and clear. Do you understand me? Prout's mouth worked silently for a moment. That was when the door of the Half Moon Saloon opened and Clayton walked in. He took in the room. He took in Prout. He took in the derringer and Edna's expression and the tension vibrating in the air, and then he said quietly, Hector Vane and 2 of his men just rode in from the South Road, and they are heading this way. Prout stood up very quickly, which was informative. Sit down, Edna said to Prout, and something in her voice made him sit. She looked at Clayton. "How long?" "4 minutes," he said. "Maybe less." She picked up the derringer and dropped it back in her pocket and looked at Prout with absolute clarity. "If Vane comes through that door and finds you sitting here, he is going to know that you have been here talking to me, and he is going to draw his own conclusions about what you may have told me. Is that what you want?" Prout understood this in an instant, which told her that his relationship with Vane was not a comfortable one. He stood up, took his paper, and left through the back. Edna stood up. She picked up her coffee cup, drained it, set it back down, and looked at Clayton. "How many men does Vane usually travel with?" "I've seen him with 3 or 4, Clayton said. "2 today, which might mean the other 2 are elsewhere, or it might mean he is trying to appear less threatening than he is." "He is trying to have a conversation," she said. "Yes," Clayton said. "Then we will have a conversation," she said. "But not in here, outside." They went out through the front of the saloon into the main street of Caldwell, where the afternoon commerce was in full swing, wagons and horses, and the sound of the cattle pens 2 blocks south. Edna stood on the boardwalk with Clayton at her shoulder and waited. Hector Vane rode in from the south end of the street on a large gray horse, flanked by 2 men she did not recognize, hired men, from their look, the kind who were paid to be present rather than conversational. Vane himself was older than she remembered from March, or perhaps she had not been paying the right kind of attention that day. He was in his mid-50s, well dressed in the way of a man with money who wore it casually, with a face that was not quite handsome but arranged in a way that suggested he was accustomed to people agreeing with him. He pulled up in front of the boardwalk and looked down at her. "Miss Carver," he said pleasantly, "I was hoping I might find you in town." "Mr. Vane," she said, "I'm told you've been taking an interest in my property." "I've always been interested in good land," he said, "and yours is good land, as I mentioned in March. I'm here to improve my earlier offer now that your legal situation has been clarified." "My legal situation," she said, "has been clarified entirely in my favor, which I believe you know." He smiled. It did not reach his eyes. "A man named Prout made some poor decisions, and you were caught up in that." "I had nothing to do with it." His gaze moved to Clayton, and something shifted in his assessment. "I don't believe I know your friend." "Clayton Barnett," Clayton said. He did not offer his hand. Vane looked at him for a moment with the calculating attention of a man filing away information. "Barnett, you worked for the Union Pacific Survey out of Dodge last year." A beat of silence. "Before that," Clayton said. "I thought I recognized you," Vane said. He looked back at Edna. "Miss Carver, I am prepared to offer you a price significantly above market value for your property. You have had a difficult spring, and there is likely more difficulty ahead, given the investigation that Prout's actions have set in motion. A clean sale now removes you from that entirely." "I am not interested in being removed from anything," Edna said. "I am interested in staying exactly where I am, on my father's land, which is mine by law and by 30 years of my family's labor, and I will thank you to stop sending men to ride my fence lines at night." Something moved in Vane's expression that was not pleasant. "I don't know what you're referring to." "Yes, you do," she said. The 2 flanking men had shifted slightly, and she was aware of it, and she was aware of Clayton being aware of it, and the street around them had gone slightly quieter in the way that Caldwell streets went quiet when something was developing. "Mr. Vane," Clayton said, and his voice was very calm and very clear, "Miss Carver has made her position clear. The property is not for sale. The county prosecutor is currently investigating the circumstances of a fraudulent lien that was filed against her title, and any further interference with her lawful use of her property is going to be of considerable interest to both the prosecutor and the territorial U.S. Marshal. I would suggest that is worth considering." Vane looked at Clayton with an expression that was between respect and irritation, the look of a man who has met something he cannot easily push aside. "You have made a friend, Miss Carver," he said, and the pleasantness was gone now, replaced with something more honest if less comfortable. I hope he is worth what he's going to cost you." He turned his horse and rode back down the street, and his two men followed, and the street resumed its normal sounds. Edna let out a slow breath. "How do you know Vane?" she asked. Clayton was quiet for a moment. "I scouted for a survey party in 1877, he said. "The survey was contracted by a land speculation company. I did not know until midway through the job that the company was using the survey data to file claims on properties that existing homesteaders were already living on. When I found out, I left. The company was connected to Vane's operation." He paused. "Which is why he recognized me, and why he'll know I know how he operates." She looked at him. "Is there more?" "There's always more," he said, "when a man like Vane is involved. But the important thing is that it's documented. I kept a copy of everything I found on that job because I knew at the time it would be useful someday." He looked at her. "I think that someday may have arrived." She stared at him. "You have evidence of how Vane's operation works?" "I have survey records and correspondence that connects Vane's land acquisition pattern to at least 3 cases of fraudulent homestead claims in Ford and Comanche counties," he said. "I sent copies to the U.S. Land Office in Topeka in 1877 and was told they were under review, which in government language means they were filed in a drawer somewhere. But if the Sumner County prosecutor starts pulling at the Prout thread, those records become relevant." She looked at him with an expression she could feel on her own face and could not quite categorize. "Clayton Barnett," she said slowly, "you walked into Hackworth's store 2 weeks ago with a box of rifle cartridges and documents that could implicate Hector Vane in a federal land fraud investigation." "I also had some thoughts about the barn roof," he said, and there was something in his expression that was the closest thing to actual humor she had yet seen from him, which was not exactly a smile but was warm in a way that made her chest do something complicated. She laughed. She had not meant to, and it came out surprised and genuine, and it had been a very long time since she had laughed like that, and it felt like something unlocking. "I would very much like," she said when she had collected herself, "for you to show me these documents." "I'll ride back and get them," he said, "and then I think we should pay a visit to the prosecutor's office." "Together," she said. "Together," he agreed. The prosecutor, a serious young man named Alderman Gates, who had been in Caldwell for 2 years and was, by all accounts, genuinely interested in doing the job correctly, spent 4 hours with Edna and Clayton that afternoon. He reviewed Clayton's survey records and correspondence. He listened carefully to Edna's account of Vane's visit in March, Prout's visit that afternoon, and the surveillance of her property. He asked methodical questions and took thorough notes. At the end of the meeting, he said, "What you have given me is significant. I want to be honest with you. Pursuing a man of Vane's resources is not simple, and I cannot promise you a swift resolution. But I can tell you that what Mr. Barnett has provided, in combination with the fraudulent deed case, is enough to justify requesting a federal investigation alongside my own." He looked at Edna. "Miss Carver, I want to advise you to exercise caution. A man who has done what Vane has done does not react well to being cornered." "I know," she said. "I mean it specifically," Gates said. "I want you to be aware that the risks here are real. He is wealthy, he is connected, and he has demonstrated that he is willing to use legal and potentially extra-legal means to achieve his goals." "I understand," she said. "What would you have me do? Sign over my father's land and go quietly?" Gates looked at her for a moment. "No," he said, "I would not. But I want you to be careful." She walked out of the prosecutor's office into the evening street with Clayton beside her, and she stopped on the boardwalk and looked up at the sky, which had gone the deep orange and purple of a Kansas sunset, and she felt something she had not felt in months that was not dread or exhaustion, but was the clean, alive feeling of being in the middle of something important that you are choosing to be in the middle of. "Dinner," Clayton said. She turned to look at him. "What?" "We should eat something before we ride back," he said. "It has been a long day." She thought about everything that had happened, the courthouse in the morning and Prout in the saloon and Vane on his gray horse and 4 hours in the prosecutor's office. And she said, "Yes, all right, dinner." They ate at a small restaurant on the 2nd Street off Main, a clean place that served good beef and that was quiet enough for conversation. They talked about Gates and the investigation and what was likely to happen over the coming weeks. And they talked about what Clayton's survey records might mean for the homesteaders in Ford and Comanche counties. And then they talked about smaller things, about the east pasture and the creek, and whether there was value in planting more winter wheat this year. At some point the conversation went quiet, not the uncomfortable quiet but the comfortable kind, and Edna became aware of a happiness in the evening that she recognized as simple and real. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes," he said. "When you came back from Wichita, when you sent those survey records to the land office in 1877, and they told you they were under review, why didn't you push harder?" He looked at his coffee cup for a moment. "I was 26 years old," he said. "I had no money and no name and no property and nothing that gave me standing in the eyes of the men I would have had to convince. I had the evidence and the moral clarity and none of the practical authority." He was quiet. "I have thought about it since, thought about what I could have done differently." "You couldn't have done more," she said. "Not then. I don't know that." "I do," she said. "You were one person with no resources and no backing in a system designed to make people like us irrelevant. You did what you could, and then you kept the records and you found someone who could use them." He looked at her. "You're being generous." "I'm being accurate," she said. "I told you I don't see the point in pretending." He was quiet for a moment in a way that felt weighted, and she waited because she had learned that he came to things in his own time. "Edna," he said. "Yes." He was looking at her with that expression again, the one she had noticed on the porch, the careful warmth. "I have been thinking, since you asked me what staying meant, about whether I could say what I actually wanted to say." She waited. "I have spent 8 years moving," he said, "because the thing I most wanted, a place that was mine and a life that was mine and someone to build it with, felt like something that had been taken away from me and was not going to come back. And I think I stopped looking for it." He paused. "And then I walked into Hackworth's store and you told me about your father's land and you looked at me like my opinion was worth something. And I thought, here is someone who is fighting for exactly the thing I gave up on." She was very still. "I know it's soon," he said. "I know we have known each other for a matter of weeks. I know there is still a great deal of difficulty ahead with Vane and the investigation and everything that comes after. I'm not asking you for anything you are not ready to give." "What are you asking?" she said. "To be here," he said. "To stay, to be part of whatever you are building." A pause. "And eventually, when you are ready and if you are willing, to be more than that." She looked at him across the dinner table in the small restaurant in Caldwell, Kansas in April of 1879, and she felt the truth of it settle in her, clean and simple. "Clayton," she said, "you never make me feel small." He looked at her, and his expression did something that she would remember for the rest of her life. The particular quality of a man hearing the most important thing he has ever been told and finding it, not earth-shattering, not surprising, but simply true. Easy in the way that true things are easy when they are finally said. "That," he said quietly, "is the easiest thing I have ever done." She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, and he turned his hand over and held it. They rode home in the dark along the creek road, the prairie sky overhead brilliant with stars, and she told him that she was not going to rush anything, which he agreed with, and that she wanted to know more about Missouri and his family, which he said he would tell her, and that she thought the east pasture would be ready for cattle by August, which he said he agreed with, and that he had been thinking the same thing. The investigation that followed was neither swift nor simple, exactly as Gates had said it would not be. The federal inquiry that Gates requested arrived in the form of a deputy U.S. Marshal named Whitfield, who came down from Topeka in May, a methodical, careful man who read Clayton's survey records with the attention of someone who understood what they meant, and who traveled to Ford and Comanche counties to interview the homesteaders whose properties had been targeted by Vane's operation. What Whitfield found confirmed the pattern. In at least 5 cases, properties had been acquired by Vane or companies connected to him following actions that bore the same signature as what had been done to Edna: fraudulent liens, forged documentation, legal pressure designed to exhaust rather than legitimately defeat the original owner's claim. In 2 of those cases, the homesteaders had sold under what they described as threats. In a 3rd case, a fire had destroyed the homestead shortly before the land was acquired. Prout, facing a criminal charge for the fraudulent deed, made the calculation that cooperation with the prosecutor was more attractive than loyalty to Vane. In June, he gave a full account of how the operation worked, how Vane identified properties with water access or strategic location, how he contracted with local agents like Prout to manufacture legal obstacles, how the pressure was systematically applied, and how Vane maintained enough distance from the front-end operations to appear uninvolved. Hector Vane was arrested in July 1879 at his compound east of Caldwell. He was charged in federal court with land fraud, conspiracy, and a number of related offenses. The trial was in Wichita in September, and it lasted 10 days. Clayton testified, presenting his survey records and his account of what he had discovered in 1877. Edna testified about the visit in March and Prout's appearance at the saloon in April and the surveillance of her property. Several homesteaders from Ford and Comanche counties testified about what had been done to them. The jury deliberated for 2 days and returned a verdict of guilty on 7 of 9 counts. Hector Vane was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison and stripped of all properties acquired through the fraudulent scheme, which meant that a number of homesteads were returned to their original owners or their heirs. It was not a perfect resolution. 2 of the displaced families did not return to reclaim their land, and the damage to those communities was not undone by a verdict, but it was a real one. Edna sat in the Wichita courthouse gallery and listened to the verdict and felt something that was not triumph but was close to it, and was also something older and quieter. Justice, perhaps, though she had lived long enough on the frontier to know that justice came incomplete when it came at all, and that the most honest thing to feel about it was grateful rather than satisfied. Clayton was beside her in the gallery, and when the verdict was read, he said nothing, just reached over and took her hand, and she held on to it with the grip of someone who has been through something and come out the other side. Prout received 2 years in the county jail and was disbarred from practicing as a land agent in Kansas. It was a lighter sentence than he deserved, which was the negotiated cost of his cooperation. Edna did not argue with it. She was not interested in revenge. She was interested in having her father's land back, which she had. She went home. In the months between April and the September trial, the farm had changed. The east pasture now had 12 head of cattle, purchased in June, with the advance on the damages that Alcott had recovered from the fraudulent claim, plus interest. The south fence was solid and the barn roof was sound and the pump worked without sticking, and the garden beside the house had gone in later than usual but was producing well enough. And Clayton was there. He had, as he said he would, stayed. He managed the cattle and helped with the farm work alongside George, who had come over the course of the summer to express his approval of Clayton in increasingly direct terms, which for George meant occasionally saying things like, "The fence posts are going in straight," when Clayton was nearby, and once telling Edna privately that the man was not wasting time or resources, which remained the highest compliment George gave. The thing between Edna and Clayton deepened the way things deepen in close proximity over time. Not explosively, not dramatically, but the way water carves stone, steadily and with direction. There were evenings on the porch and long conversations about everything and nothing, and mornings where she brought him coffee at the barn without either of them making anything of it. And a day in late June, when a summer storm came in fast from the west, and they spent 2 hours running between the barn and the house securing everything that needed securing and ended up sheltering in the barn doorway watching the rain come down in sheets. And she leaned against him without deciding to, and he put his arm around her shoulders, and neither of them mentioned it afterward, but something had shifted into a different place. He told her about Missouri in pieces over those months. His father, who had been a good man and a poor manager of money. His mother, who had died when he was 15, and whose absence had left a shape in the family that none of them had ever quite figured out how to fill. The farm, which he had loved in the particular way you love a place you grew up in, with the whole body and not just the mind. Losing it at 22, which had been the specific kind of loss that teaches you not to count on things that can be taken. She told him things too. Her mother, who she barely remembered but whose presence she felt in the house sometimes, in the way the morning light fell across the kitchen floor. Her father, who had been the architecture of her life for so long that his absence still felt like a gap she did not know how to walk around. The 3 months between February and April, which had been the loneliest and most frightened she had ever been, though she had not been able to admit it until the weight was off. "Were you frightened when I came?" he asked once, not as a challenge, just a question. "Not of you," she said. "Of needing someone." He nodded slowly. "I understand that." "I know you do," she said. "That's what made it easier." By August, there was a conversation that needed to happen that they had both been circling without initiating. Edna was the one who started it because she was who she was and the indirect approach had never suited her. They were sitting on the porch steps in the late summer evening after supper, and the cattle were settled in the south pasture and the sky was going amber, and she said, "I have been thinking about what you said in April about being more than what we are." He was quiet for a moment. "So have I. I am ready," she said, "if you still are." He turned to look at her, and there was something in his face that she had never seen quite so clearly before, a relief that went bone deep, the kind that comes from waiting for something for a long time and finally seeing it arrive. "More than ready," he said. "Then I have one condition," she said. He waited. "Equals," she said, "in everything. The decisions and the work and the management of this place and everything that comes with it. I will not have any other arrangement." "That is the only arrangement I would want," he said. She looked at him. "I'm serious, Clayton." "So am I," he said, and the steadiness in it was the same steadiness she had seen in him from the first day. The quality of a man who says what he means because he has not spent his life finding it useful to do otherwise. She reached over and held his face in her hands, which surprised both of them slightly, and she kissed him, which was straightforward and warm and exactly what it should be, and he put his hands over hers and kissed her back in the same way. When she sat back, she said, "Well." "Well," he said, and finally, fully, he smiled. They were married in October 1879 in Caldwell at the small Methodist church on the east side of town that had been there since 1872. The ceremony was conducted by the Reverend Mallory, a lean man with kind eyes who asked them their vows in a voice measured to the size of the room and no larger. George was there, which mattered more to Edna than the other attendees. Alcott came down from Wichita, which surprised her. Sheriff Horner came, which she appreciated. A few of her neighbors from the surrounding farms, people who had known Amos Carver and who had watched the proceedings of the spring and summer with the particular attention of people who understood that what happened to one homestead in the county affected all the others. Edna wore her good blue dress that she had made herself 4 years ago and had never had much occasion to wear, and she put her hair up in the way her father had called her church-going hair, and she carried a handful of late-season prairie asters because she liked them, and because cut flowers from a shop seemed wrong for who she was. Clayton wore his best coat, which she had not previously seen, dark and well-fitting, and he had shaved and combed his hair and looked so clean and particular that she had almost laughed when she saw him, because it was so obvious that he was not accustomed to being looked at and did not quite know what to do with it. They exchanged their vows in the small, sun-filled church in October 1879, and they meant every word, and it was not complicated because it was right. Afterward, back at the farm, George had roasted a leg of mutton, and there were pies from the neighbors and good coffee, and people talked and ate, and the afternoon went long and warm. And at the end of it, Edna stood in her kitchen with a plate of leftover pie and Clayton beside her and the house quiet around them, and felt the specific happiness of a life that is, in this moment, exactly what it ought to be. The years that followed were built year by year the way the frontier was built, with work and weather and occasional disaster and more occasional grace. Their first child was a boy, born in the summer of 1881, and they named him Amos for her father. He arrived on a Thursday morning in July with the considerable drama of first births, and was greeted by Edna with exhausted wonder, and by Clayton with an expression so undone that George, who had been present on the porch waiting, told him afterward that he had never seen a grown man look quite so comprehensively taken by surprise by something they had known was coming. Amos Barnett grew fast and loud, and with strong opinions about everything, which seemed genetically inevitable given his parentage, and he was 2 years old and already following Clayton around the barn with absolute conviction that he was helping when their second child arrived. A girl, born in 1883, named Martha after Clayton's mother. Martha was quieter than her brother but not smaller in her own way, and she had her mother's directness and her father's patience in a combination that seemed, from an early age, like it would be formidable in a grown person. The farm expanded. The 12 cattle became 25 and then 40. They hired another hand, a young man from Missouri named Ellis who had come west following a bad year on his family's land, and Edna recognized something in him that made her think of Clayton at 26, and she told Clayton this, and he agreed, and they gave Ellis room and board and a fair wage and enough responsibility to teach him. The East Pasture Creek, which had been the thing everyone had wanted most about the Carver property, was properly improved with a diversion channel and a holding pond that made the farm's water supply reliable even in dry summers, which was something Edna had been planning since before the whole crisis with Prout and Vane, and which she accomplished with considerable satisfaction in the spring of 1882. George remained on the farm through all of it, aging steadily and slowing his work without stopping it, because he was not a man who stopped. He taught young Amos the things he had taught Edna's father, how to read weather and soil and animal behavior, how to understand the land as a living thing with its own logic, and Amos absorbed it with the voraciousness of a child who has discovered something genuinely interesting. In the winter of 1884, George died quietly in his sleep, at an age none of them knew precisely, because George had never been interested in keeping track of it. He was buried in the small plot on the southwest corner of the farm where Amos Carver was also buried, and it was one of the few times Edna Barnett cried in front of her children and did not apologize for it, because she believed crying was an honest thing, and she was not going to pretend it wasn't. Clayton stood beside her at the graveside in the February cold with his arm around her shoulders, and later that evening when the children were in bed, and the house was quiet, he sat with her at the kitchen table and let her talk about George, all of it, the 15 years he had worked with her father, and the 2 years he had worked with her, and what he had been, the kind of person who shows up and stays and does not make any kind of performance of it. And Clayton listened in the way he had always listened, completely and without hurry, and when she ran out of words he said, "He knew you'd be all right." She looked at him. "He stayed until he knew that," Clayton said. That was what he was doing. She thought about it and knew he was right, and it helped in the way that true things help, not by making the loss less but by giving it its correct shape. Caldwell grew and changed through the 1880s, as cattle towns do. The drives peaked and began to diminish as the railroads pushed further south and the ranching patterns shifted, and by the mid-1880s the town was working out what it was going to be when it was no longer primarily a cattle town. Some people left. Others built things meant to last. Edna became, without particularly intending to, something of a figure in the county. The case with Prout and Vane had been talked about, and the return of the stolen homesteads had been appreciated by the communities affected, and Edna's refusal to be intimidated was a story that traveled. Women who were dealing with similar property disputes or legal difficulties began to ride out to the Barnett farm to ask her advice, and she gave it directly and without charge, because her father had told her that knowledge hoarded was knowledge wasted, and because she understood from her own experience how much the absence of straightforward counsel cost people. Clayton watched this with the particular quiet warmth of a man who sees someone he loves being exactly who they are in the world and finds it uncomplicated to be proud of. He had, in the years since his arrival in Caldwell, built a reputation of his own for good management, for honest dealing, for knowing the land and knowing livestock, and knowing the legal terrain well enough to be useful to people navigating it. He was not a loud presence in the county, but he was a known one, the way solid things are known. They argued sometimes, because two people with strong opinions who live and work in close proximity and have agreed to be equals will necessarily disagree. And Edna did not think well of relationships where people pretended they never disagreed. They argued about land use and money management and parenting approaches, and the relative merits of various political positions, because it was 1884 and there were elections happening and both of them had opinions. The arguments were real and sometimes heated and always resolved, because they had made a practice early on of not letting things sit overnight unaddressed, which was a discipline that cost something in the short term and paid significantly in the long. What they did not argue about was the important things. They did not argue about whether the other person's opinion mattered, because it did, and they both knew it. They did not argue about whether they were in this together, because they were, and that had been established in the first weeks of knowing each other and had not wobbled since. There was a moment in the summer of 1885 that Edna would return to in her memory more than once in the years after. She had been working in the garden in the early morning before the heat came up, and she could see Clayton in the south pasture moving along the fence line with Amos, who was 4 years old and intent on being involved in everything. She watched Clayton crouch down and show Amos something on the ground, a track, probably, or a section of fence that needed attention, and she watched her son lean in with absolute concentration, the way children lean in when something is being given to them properly. And she stood in her garden in the Kansas morning with dirt on her hands and felt a happiness so complete and so specific that she could not have described it in words, only in that image, her husband and her son in the south pasture, the prairie sky above them enormous and brilliant, the farm around her producing and alive, and hers and Clayton's, theirs. In 1887, she wrote to Theodore Alcott in Wichita on a matter unrelated to her own property, a widow in the next township who was facing a fraudulent probate claim on her husband's estate, a pattern she recognized. Alcott, who had maintained a correspondence with her since the 1879 case, took the matter and resolved it successfully. He told her in his response that she had become, without the benefit of legal training, one of the more useful people in the county when it came to identifying fraudulent property claims, and that if the state of Kansas were ever to allow women to practice law, he would recommend her immediately. She told Clayton about this letter over supper and read him the passage, and his response was, "He's not wrong." She looked at him. "I cannot practice law." "Not yet," Clayton said. "Kansas will change." He said it with the certainty of someone who believes in the direction of things, and she thought about all the arguments happening in the state and in Washington about what women were entitled to, and she thought about Amos and Martha and what their world would be when they were grown, and she said, "I believe you're right." The third child came in 1888, another boy, named Robert, who arrived with even more drama than his brother had, and immediately demonstrated a temper that subsided into an easygoing nature within minutes of its expression, which seemed like it would serve him well in the world. Edna was 35, and she felt not old, because she did not feel old. She felt more fully herself than she had at 25, but aware of time in a new way. The farm was established and productive. Her children were healthy and well cared for. The investigations following the Vane case had returned land to homesteaders across 3 counties. Clayton was, at 40, the same man she had married at 30, with an additional decade of roots in one place. And the roots showed in him the way they show in something that has been given time to settle, not rigid, but deep. She was in the kitchen on an October evening in 1889, 10 years after they had stood in the saloon and then ridden home in the dark and then sat on the porch steps, and she had told him he never made her feel small, when Clayton came in from the barn and sat down across the table from her. He had mud on his boots, and he looked like a man who has been doing real work all day, which he had been. "I was thinking today," he said, "about that first week, in Hackworth's store." She looked up from the account she was reviewing. "What about it?" "I was afraid," he said, which startled her slightly because Clayton did not often lead with that word. "Of what?" "Of staying," he said. "Of wanting to stay badly enough to be afraid of it. I had not let myself want that in a long time." He was looking at her steadily. "I thought today about what would have happened if I had gone to the Fenwick spread instead." "Don't," she said. "I'm not dwelling on it," he said. "I'm appreciating it. There's a difference." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. "Edna, what we have here, what we've built." She turned her hand over and held his. "I know. I just want to say it plainly sometimes," he said, "because I mean it plainly." She looked at him. The man who had walked through a saloon door in the critical moment and stayed afterward, who had fixed her barn roof and found her a lawyer, and held her hand through a federal trial and argued with her about land use, and raised her children beside her, and crouched in the south pasture showing her son how to read a fence line, who had never once, in 10 years and more difficulty than most people faced, made her feel like anything less than the full person she was. "I know you mean it," she said. "That's why it works." He squeezed her hand. Outside, the Kansas autumn was settling in around the farm, the fields going golden and the creek running steady, and the cattle in the south pasture moving slow and content in the evening cool. From the back of the house, they could hear Robert, who was 1 year old, making the exploratory noises of a baby who has discovered that making noise produces results. And from further back, the sound of Amos and Martha arguing about something with the energetic conviction of children who are absolutely certain they are right. Edna looked at the accounts on the table and looked at her husband's hand over hers, and looked through the window at the evening sky over the land her father had built and that she had kept, and that was now, irrevocably and completely, home. She was not small. She had never been small. She had been a woman alone on 40 acres with a fraudulent claim against her deed, and a grief she had not had time to finish. And she had fought for what was hers and won. And she had built something that would outlast the fighting, which was always the point. And she had done it with a man who understood, without being told and without making anything of it, that helping someone fight was not the same as fighting for them, and that standing beside someone was not the same as standing in front of them, and that the most real respect you could show a person was simply to see them clearly and not flinch from what you found. "Come eat something," she said. "I made that beef stew you like." "In a minute," he said. He was still holding her hand and looking at her with that expression, the easy warmth, the look she knew as well as the sound of the creek or the quality of the morning light in her own kitchen. "Clayton," she said. "Edna," he said. She smiled at him. He smiled back fully, the smile that had taken her months to earn the first time and that she had never gotten tired of. Amos came running in from the back room at that moment, with the full velocity of a 4-year-old who has decided his presence is urgently required, followed by Martha at 7 years old, who was clearly pursuing him with the focused energy of an older sister who has a point to make. and the moment broke into the ordinary beautiful chaos of an evening with children. And Edna got up to serve the stew, and Clayton lifted Amos onto his knee to stop the running, and said something in the boy's ear that made him laugh. And Martha settled at the table with the satisfaction of someone who has won on points if not in body. And outside, the Kansas night came in clean and full of stars. The farm was theirs. The life was theirs. And it was, as Clayton had said it would be, exactly what he had stayed for. The years did not stop coming, because they never do. Robert learned to walk, and then to run, and then to take apart the pump mechanism to see how it worked, which required reassembly on 3 separate occasions, and which everyone, even Edna, eventually admitted showed a kind of mechanical intelligence that should probably be encouraged rather than discouraged. He grew into a boy who was happiest with his hands in something complicated, and who spent his adolescence becoming the person you sent for when something mechanical failed. Amos, at 15 in 1896, was already doing the work of a full hand on the farm, and talking about whether he wanted to study animal husbandry when he was grown, which led to a conversation about colleges and possibilities that would not have happened a generation earlier on a Kansas homestead, and which Edna pursued with the same directness she gave everything. If the Kansas State Agricultural College in Manhattan could take her son, she would find a way to send him. Martha, at 13, had her mother's pen. She had been writing in a journal since she was 8, and writing letters to anyone who would correspond with her, and had discovered, at 12, that the Caldwell newspaper would sometimes publish letters from readers, including letters from a 13-year-old girl about the legal status of women in the territory, if those letters were argued with sufficient precision. Edna read the published letters and felt something that was pride, but was also something larger, the particular feeling of watching an idea you have carried pass into a person who will carry it further than you could. She told Clayton about the letters, and he read them at the kitchen table and set them down and said, "She's better at this than both of us." "Yes," Edna agreed. "Good," he said, with the same simplicity with which he said most true things. The land reform movements that had been building through the late 1880s and into the 1890s, the populist movement, and the debates about women's suffrage, and the ongoing negotiations of what Kansas would be in the next century, all of these were present at the Barnett kitchen table in the way that things are present when the people living in a time are paying attention to it. Edna testified twice before the state legislature in Topeka in the 1890s, once on property rights for widows and unmarried women, once on the procedures for challenging fraudulent land claims, and both times she went with her documentation prepared, and her argument organized and her voice steady, because 20 years of being who she was had taught her that the most effective thing she could bring into a room was complete knowledge of what she was talking about. Clayton accompanied her to Topeka both times and waited in the corridor outside the chamber, and both times when she came out he was the first person she saw, and both times he said, "How did it go?" with genuine interest, and without any of the particular qualities she had seen in men who ask questions they already think they know the answers to. She told him how it went. He listened. They went to dinner afterward and talked about it until the restaurant closed. In 1900, Kansas was 20 years further along from the place it had been in 1879, and the Barnett farm was 20 years deeper in its roots, and Edna was 47 years old and Clayton was 51, and the children were grown and launched, or nearly so. And the land was as good as it had ever been, and better managed than it had been at the start, because 20 years of learning the specific characteristics of 40 acres of Kansas soil teaches you things no general knowledge can. There were Sunday mornings in those years where they sat on the porch together with coffee. The porch had been expanded in 1886 and had good chairs now, and watched the morning come across the prairie, and it was not dramatic. It was the ordinary profound thing of two people who have built a life together sitting in the fact of it. She was, Edna thought on one such morning, deeply and completely happy. Not the happiness of things going well or problems being solved, though those were part of it. The happiness that lives underneath those things, the kind that is structural, that holds the shape of a life even when particular moments are difficult or sad or ordinary. The happiness of a self that is fully itself, with work that matters and land that is real and a man beside her who had never, not once, tried to make her less than she was. "What are you thinking?" Clayton asked. She looked at him in the morning light, the man who had walked into Hackworth's General Store in April 1879 with a box of rifle cartridges and a name she had needed, who had fixed her barn and stayed for everything else. "That I am glad you walked through that door," she said. He looked at her with that expression, the easy warmth, decades deep now and still completely honest. "So am I," he said, "every single day." She reached over and took his hand, and he held it, and the Kansas morning came in full and golden and alive around the farm that was theirs, the life that was theirs, the decades of good and difficult and real that had made them exactly who they were. It had been the easiest thing, he had told her once, to never make her feel small. And she had understood since the beginning what he meant by it, not that it required no effort, but that the effort came from a place so natural in him that it did not register as effort at all. He simply saw her. He had seen her from the first day. And in seeing her fully and clearly and without flinching, he had given her something she had not known she was missing until it arrived. She was Edna Carver Barnett, and she was on her father's land, and the world beyond the creek was loud and complicated and still full of injustice that needed addressing, and she would get up tomorrow and address it. But this morning she sat with her husband's hand in hers and the sun coming up over the south pasture and the sound of the farm waking around them, and she let it be what it was. The whole, complete, hard-won, beautiful thing. Hers.